Good morning. On behalf of the Center for the Critical Analysis of Social Difference, the Engendering Archives Project, and all those involved in assembling the conference, I want to welcome you to Columbia University and to New York City. This conference is dedicated to examining the ways in which cities and societies create a communal memory of catastrophic events and the far-reaching consequences that result from establishing those meanings. The organizers will ask us to reflect on the imagery, the dominant narratives, and the ceremonies that create shared memory. It is an innovative, scholarly project that they are undertaking. To appreciate the power of the political and social forces that assign meaning to cataclysmic events that are still fresh in our memories, it is first necessary to recognize that a communal memory does not evolve naturally or inevitably. I think we all have the sense, wrongly, that these things just happen rather than that they are created. So it's quite the opposite. The differences among us, described by gender, ethnicity, class, and so on, produce a kaleidoscope of individual experiences and responses to catastrophic events. There's no better evidence of this fact than the 600 testimonials assembled for the September 11th Oral History and Narrative Memory Project by Mary Marshall Clark, the director of Columbia Center for Oral History, and Professor Peter Behrman. The Oral History Project is proving to be an invaluable scholarly resource, and we are fortunate to be able to use it as a centerpiece of this conference. We are also pleased to be joined today by a group of wonderful panelists and speakers, a truly multidisciplinary gathering that includes artists, architects, journalists, and scholars from the many outstanding universities and colleges around the region and the country. It is fitting that this conversation has been organized to mark the 10th anniversary of September 11th. At first, it was natural for most New Yorkers to see the devastation of that day through a lens that extended only to the city limits. But over time, a larger awareness has emerged that the experience of New York carries lessons for cities around the world and vice versa. Issues ranging from disaster preparedness and managing psychological trauma to public architecture and urban planning. Just as significantly, September 11th and its aftermath have presented New Yorkers with the opportunity to recognize their common bond with citizens of other injured cities around the globe. There is a great human need to better understand how major events shape and our memory, our minds, and our actions in so many multiple ways and in different ways for different people. And this conference is a great beginning contribution. The conference organizers who provided the vision for the discussions scheduled today and tomorrow are Lori Novak, an artist and professor of photography and imaging at NYU's Tisch School of the Arts, Laura Wexler, professor of American Studies at Yale, Tina Kampt, professor of Women's Studies at Barnard College, Professor Jean Howard of Columbia, and our Department of English and Comparative Literature, and Marianne Hirsch, professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia and former co-director of the Center for Critical Analysis of Social Difference. Please recognize their efforts and welcome to the podium Professor Marianne Hirsch.
Welcome. First of all, an enormous thanks to President Bollinger for your continued support, for your part in this conference, which you encouraged and enabled so generously, but most of all for your foundational support for the Center for the Critical Analysis of Social Difference, for recognizing the kind of interdisciplinary work in the arts, the humanities, and the social sciences that we do, and the importance of that work. The Center directed by Laila Abulugod, is a research center dedicated to the study of the global dynamics of social difference and to the creative invention of alternative social structures, and it seeks to seek new scholarly agenda for the future. I have many more thank yous in a moment, but first allow me to tell you a brief story about one injured city and its afterlife. 70 years ago this week, in the early morning of October 11, 1941, official placards appeared tacked to trees and walls all over the Romanian city of Cernăuți, formerly Austrian Czernowitz. They announced that by 6 p.m. on that day, all Jews were to move to a small area in and around the old Jewish quarter. They were to bring enough clothes and food along for a few days, lock their apartments, and deposit their keys with officials who would be collecting them. This is the area that was marked out for the ghetto. My parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles were among those forced into a makeshift ghetto in this manner. But before that day, Romanian gendarmes and Nazi Einsatzgruppen had already shot hundreds of Jews on the banks of the river Prut and had devastated the Jewish population of nearby towns and villages. 70 years ago tomorrow, on October 15th, deportations from Cernăuți to camps and ghettos further east in Transnistria began, and 2/3 of the city's Jews were forcibly transported there. My own family was fortunate to be among the 1/3 who were rescued from deportation by the city's Romanian mayor, Traian Popovici. And in fact, hoping to survive together, my parents married in the ghetto on October 18th. But of the more than 60,000 Jews who lived in Cernăuți before the start of the war, constituting the largest of several population groups who shared the urban space, only a little more than half were alive at its conclusions, and most of those were soon dispersed throughout the world. And today, in the now Ukrainian Chernivtsi, few Jews remain, and even fewer traces can be found of their influential presence and of the painful history of their persecution and expulsion. This is all you see, this little plaque of the history of the ghetto. Is Chernivtsi a wounded city? Strangely, even after 55 years of Soviet rule, its center, after some recent efforts to repaint and refurbish, looks largely intact. Though, of course, buildings were transformed to new purposes that disguise their original uses. One former Jewish synagogue, for example, is now a cinema and billiard hall, another a factory for Christian tombstones. And at the same time, some fledgling efforts at memorialization have begun to reinscribe traces of forgotten lives, plaques to poets and artists, Jewish poets and artists, a small 2-room museum. But still there are wounds that cannot be repaired, even on the surface. This is what the Jewish cemetery looks like. This is but one of thousands such stories occurring throughout the globe over the last century. Thousands of injured cities where contested memories collide. And these remote histories are not forgotten. I was very moved to read that earlier this week in Tel Aviv, over 700 people gathered to remember the Transnistria deportations of 70 years ago. But you know, at the same time, I was also thinking, what is the point, actually, of commemorating past catastrophes, on site or elsewhere? What are the politics of memorialization, especially when survivors and their descendants of this and similar histories move on to make their lives in urban spaces in which some citizen groups are persecuted and separated, their lives deemed dispensable? When survivors themselves are now among the agents of oppression, can this cycle be broken? Could, or how could, their acts of memory be mobilized for progressive political use and for a different future? This conference, which I'm so very pleased to introduce, will reflect precisely on ways we might imagine alternative futures and other paths that might have been. The conference was planned, as President Bollinger noted, by the Engendering Archives Working Group of the Center for the Critical Analysis for Social Difference. And for the last 3 years, some of us, writers, literary and cultural critics, anthropologists, historians, artists, architects, archivists, and activists, have been discussing archives and the politics of memory, examining specifically the power structures that shape the stories and lives that a culture remembers and those that it suppresses and forgets. As our individual work is inspired and fed by these meetings, we have all come to see how much our commitments and strategies to act for social change benefit from a space for thinking, writing, and talking together, such as the one that the university and this center has allowed us to create. And as a culmination of our project, we chose to enlarge our conversations by planning a conference on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of the events of September 11, 2001. And of course, this discussion now could not be centered on New York alone. It had to reach across borders to place these events and their after effects into global context, to assess their impact on other cities and other lives marked by the effects of social difference. We hope to expose the workings of political structures that exploit disaster for war and profit, and most importantly, to imagine together more life-affirming modes of social life for the future. Today, as the site of Occupy Wall Street, itself inspired by movements in Cairo and Athens, and an inspiration to other such movements from Boston to Portland, New York seems like just the right place for these conversations. We are honored to be joined by a truly remarkable group of speakers from around the globe, representing just such different fields and approaches, such different forms of scholarly, artistic, and political engagement. I welcome all our speakers and thank them for coming. I welcome all of you on behalf not just of myself, but of a large group of conference organizers, even beyond the wonderful list that Lee Bollinger gave you. It includes all the moderators to all the sessions and many of our co-sponsors. We all work together to make this happen. And if you look at your program, you will see how many centers and institutes at Columbia, at Barnard, at Yale, and at NYU have joined together with us to sponsor this conference. Their range and reach is indicative of the crossings and interconnections that we hope to make in the next 2 days. So I'd like to thank a number of people, please bear with me, and institutes and centers here who have come together for this. First, the Center for the Critical Analysis of Social Difference. Its director, Laila Abulugod, and associate director, Laura Tsiolkovsky. I'd like to thank the School of the Arts, the Neiman Gallery, and the Miller Theater, our hosts for today, especially Brenna St. George. I'd like to thank the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, who are going to be our hosts for tomorrow, and especially Lucia Halajan. There's an exhibit upstairs in Neiman Gallery. It exhibits the wonderful work of Lori Novak. It's called Encounters in the Aftermath, and I'd like to thank Lori for her work, and Laura Wexler, Audrey Sands, Tess Korobkin, and Emma Balash for making the exhibit possible. The Office of the President has been instrumental in helping us put this together. I'd like to thank also the Friends of Columbia University Libraries, the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, the Institute for Social and Economic Research and Policy, the Columbia Center for Oral History, the Committee on Global Thought, the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society, the Institute for Research on Women and Gender, the Institute for Religion and Public Life, Religion, Culture, and Public Life, the Center for Palestine Studies, the Barnard Center for Research on Women, the Yale Public Humanities Program, and the Hemispheric Institute for Performance and Politics. We're really gratified to be joined in this project by the International Center on Photography, whose exhibit, Remembering 9/11, is on now, and your programs will get you into the exhibit for free. There's also, they wanted me to announce, there's a 3 p.m. tomorrow tour that you are invited to join, and you can also go see the exhibit anytime. Now, a few individuals, because all these centers are made up of people who work hard. Kate Trebas, I think you all know. You might think she's a conference planner, but no, she's a brilliant graduate student, and she has given so much of her time. She's done such an extraordinary, elegant, and gracious work on behalf of the conference, so I'd like to ask you for a hand for Kate. Kyle Kraus, Carrie Walker, and Veronica Blake, events planners extraordinaire, have helped us with every detail. I'd like to thank all our helpers, student helpers, Sonali Thakkar, Jenny James, and all our other volunteers, and especially also Nadine Vassallo and Paige Jackson of Earwag, who put all this together for us. You'll see how beautiful the posters and programs are. We have a beautiful image by the artist Lori Nix, who agreed to let us use it. Emily Waters designed the poster. Ryan Weaver designed the art brochure and the program, and James Byram designed our website. And Lori Novak oversaw every detail of every visual detail here. I'm going to turn to the panel in a moment. Just be aware that we're in a different location tomorrow. We were going to be in Avery Hall. And I also want to say that I want to extend a special thanks to Anne McClintock, who was involved in every detail of planning the program of the conference, who helped us envision it, and who unfortunately cannot join us for her paper tomorrow. But she's definitely here in all the details of our conversations. So thank you all, and I'm going to turn the podium over to Saidiya.
Thank you all for being here. Unfortunately, I'm going to give short shrift to our distinguished panel and just try to briefly underline their importance to the conference. Let me set this up for the next one. Okay. It is a pleasure to moderate the opening panel of the conference and to introduce these distinguished scholars. The work of Ariella Azoulay, Saskia Sassen, and Karen Till has provided many of the formative concepts of the Intercity Conference. Collectively, their work has forced us to reckon with the endemic forms of violence that structure life in urban and occupied territories. Their numerous books and articles invite us to rethink the space of the city as a zone of new and proliferating forms of asymmetrical war, as wounded by forms of structural violence, and as a space of care and a threshold for new forms of sociality and affiliation among the governed. As well, their work demands that we consider the character and duration of catastrophe not as an event that interrupts or disfigures the normative order of life or as an exceptional occurrence, but rather to think catastrophe as a chronic and prolonged situation that defines the relation between citizens and non-citizens, wealthy elites and slum dwellers, global and local forms of authority, and refugees. And it is to these questions that the panel will today attend. Karen Till is our first speaker.
I would like to thank, just very briefly again, the Center for Critical Analysis of Social Difference for organizing this event, and Columbia University for hosting us, and a particular thanks again to Mariana Hirsch and Kate Trevis. A man in his late 20s wearing a tuxedo walks onto a stage with a lit torch. It is night. He sits down, sentinel-like as if at a doorway stop, and begins to light matches. We are seated outdoors in downtown Bogota. It's December 2004, and candles and spotlights illuminate the figures of the actors who move across the stage in a very empty, large field. Furniture brought in or improvised by the actors suggests rooms in now empty houses that once were occupied. And around the stage, former streets of a neighborhood are marked out with candles and white paper bags. Behind the actors, two very large screens, each more than 3 stories high, project images and sound recordings of the neighborhood that once existed here, known locally as El Cartucho. These screens also project images of the performance as it is being performed. A clown becomes a magician. From the torch held by his assistants, he lights a paper and performs his interpretation of Heiner Müller's The Liberation of Prometheus. And recall, in addition to the basic story, whereby Prometheus brings fire to the humans and is consequently banished by the gods for his transgression and lashed to a remote craggy rock where his liver is pecked at by an eagle for eternity, Müller added a twist. After thousands of years, Heracles attempts to rescue Prometheus and even kills the eagle upon which Prometheus relies for survival. But Prometheus does not want to leave his horrible situation. He fears what freedom might mean. Now, with his young assistant, the magician will tap his empty magic box with a wand and pull out 2 white doves out of nowhere. Images of his performance and previously recorded footage of the elderly man at home are projected behind him and his assistant. We learn that the elderly man joined the circus at the age of 9. We watch images of him and his grandson dressing up as clowns. They are in temporary housing, and a pale green wall of their single room is adorned with their belongings, carefully organized according to their function: a frying pan, a pair of scissors, a material bag, and framed pictures. In other clips, we see them looking out of the window of the city bus across fields in which buildings are under different phases of demolition. It's upon these raised fields that we now sit. The magician throws the flapping doves up to the night sky. They are free, and amidst our applause, with bolero music beginning to play, the magician and his young assistant invites us, the audience, to come join them and the other performers on stage and dance atop the ruins of the Santa Inés El Cartucho neighborhood, their former homes. Through the Proyecto Prometeo performance, the residents of Santa Inés El Cartucho invited guests to attend to their embodied stories of displacement on the very 20 hectares or 200,000 square meters of raised earth from which they had been forcibly removed. Within 2 years of their performance, this historic neighborhood would be unveiled as a public park of the third millennium, Parque Tercer Milenio, as part of one of the mayor's attempt to green the city. Now, in contrast to the official story of sustainable urban renewal, which designated the area as in need of cleaning up, thereby rendering existing routines and spaces of everyday dwelling and the residents themselves, referred often by officials as disposables, as invisible or non-existent. The stories of Prometeo honored residents' right to the city according to an ethics of mutual witnessing and place-based care. Proyecto Prometeo resulted in acts of witnessing, not so much of so-called slum clearance, but of remembering life in an otherwise marginalized part of the city. Working with residents over a number of years to develop and create the Prometeo performances and other projects, the artistic collaborative Mapa Teatro Laboratory of Artists raised ethical questions about the politics of placemaking in the name of progress, at the same time that they called attention to the possibilities of art, memory, and imagination in their city. Residents and artists challenged city authorities' understanding of them as invisible, as well as official visions of and claims to build a sustainable city. Through their stories and performances, residents asserted individual, collective, spatial, and temporal claims to having rights to their city. They communicated and enacted their experience of the city as inhabited, an understanding based upon both psychic attachments to particular places as well as the fragile social ecologies that go into their making. Indeed, as Rolf Abderhalden Cortes of Mapa Teatro testified, the community's stories were a substantive part of the architecture of the neighborhood's memory. Now, as Henri Lefebvre reminds us, the discourses, practices, and desires tied to imagining urban futures are inherently political. They inform how individuals make and justify their decisions and act. However, when critical analysis of urban space privilege representations of the city as property, according to development trajectories, or according to dehumanized spatial networks only, the complex spatialities and temporalities of the lived city fall off most urban maps. Performances such as Proyecto Prometeo, then, we must understand is more than merely subjective, biased, or local. By challenging current models of the city that pathologically designate districts as either good or bad, or entire cities as either ordered or chaotic, or in need of stability to become more resilient. Such place-based artistic practices offer us significant lessons about questions of citizenship and social justice in the city. And in my book in progress, in my brief talk today, I'd like to suggest that when considering cities as wounded, we are then invited to consider more than just urban futures based upon territorial understandings of the city, but it is based upon a larger unfolding set of processes that include memory work and what I call a place-based ethics of care. And so today I'm going to just briefly give you a few snippets from my ethnographic research working with and about artists and residents in places as diverse as Roanoke, Virginia, Cape Town, South Africa, and Bogota, Colombia. And I hope that my larger questions and argument might also encourage a broader discussion of injured cities and urban afterlives. Now, contemporary cities in different parts of the world continue to be structured by histories of settlement clearances, geographies of displacement, and state-perpetrated violence. In her study of urban renewal programs in the U.S., Columbia professor Mindy Foley-Love examined the devastation wrought upon African American communities and American cities between 1949 and 73, when over 2,500 historic neighborhoods were bulldozed in 993 cities, displacing at least 1 million or more people. Today, in cities such as Roanoke, neighborhoods such as the Gainsborough community that were affected by these urban renewal programs, and of course, they didn't ever receive the improvements or housing promised by city planners. They now have streetscapes with many empty lots, as depicted here in red, as well as buildings held by absentee landlords that have decaying infrastructure. Now, within this type of a landscape, healthy social webs are hard to establish without resources and after many years of deterioration. A library now functions as a significant community center for intergenerational learning as a result of citizen activism. But again, without resources, it's hard to rebuild. This was once a historic and central neighborhood, but Gainsborough has become an example of what Peter Marcuse calls an outcast ghetto. That is an area of the city even more segregated from mainstream political, social, cultural, and economic urban life than was the case during the Jim Crow era or in the post-war 1950s or to 1970s period. So I understand Roanoke as a wounded city, and I use the metaphor wounded cities to acknowledge the ways that particular histories of physical destruction, displacement, and individual and social trauma resulting from state-perpetrated violence continue to structure current social and spatial relations. Now, while such legacies are typical of many post-colonial societies, they indeed haunt many, if not most, Western cities as well. And so in this respect, my definition is distinct from definitions of the city as injured in the sense of following so-called natural events or unexpected events, quote, such as war, or recent forms of globalization. So here I distinguish myself from the edited collections of, by Schneider and Susser called Wounded Cities, or by Vail and Campanella's edited volume called The Resilient City. My understanding of the city is distinct from these authors that theorize the city according to more passive bounded territorial definitions or according to systems models. For example, Schneider and Susser define the city as a, quote, site where powerful external forces intersect. Now, in contrast, and again taking inspiration from Henri Lefebvre, I understand the city as an oeuvre, as constituted by its inhabitants through ongoing acts of placemaking. As human and non-human lives move, interact, and engage with others through complex temporal and spatial pathways, the symbolic and material places they make also become part of their bodies, selves, social groups, and environments, and the city itself. And I just want to take a few minutes to unpack that definition. So I use the metaphor of the wound to suggest temporally and spatially dynamic processes. The moment of the wound is always unfolding. It's neither singular nor inevitable. It signifies personal, social, political, and environmental traumas. And at the same time, through memory work and what I call a place-based ethics of cares, individuals and groups may confront and take some responsibility for the failures of the democratic state and its violences. And I'll talk about that later in my talk. So I understand cities that are wounded in both metonymical and psychosocial ways. Metonymically, the daily mazeways and social ecologies of places constitute urban processes. Psychosocially, individuals and groups have intimate relationships with places and their city. Such an understanding of the city highlights the complex interface between bodies, memory, social groups, and the lived city, and place and affect. And here I draw heavily on Mindy Foley-Love's interpretation of African American displacement according to her concept of root shock. Root shock is the traumatic stress reaction to the destruction of all or part of one's emotional ecosystem. And Foley-Love suggests that root shock is similar to the psychological shock experienced by a person who loses massive amounts of fluid as a result of injury, a shock that threatens the body's ability to function. Now, when individuals move through and navigate and create environments according to unlimited possible pathways or routines or patterns of movement, they end up creating their own kind of mazeway that provides individuals with security. To quote Fully Love, just as the body has a system to maintain its internal balance, so too the individual has a way to maintain the external balance between him or herself and the world. Now, when individuals are forced to leave their neighborhoods or their protective mazeways are destroyed, the root shock that follows, according to Fully Love, may stay with the person for a lifetime. And I understand here medical anthropologists Arthur and Joan Kleinman's work as complementary. They have done a lot of research trying to explore the interface between bodily and social memory, and they use the concept of enacted assemblages. They draw upon Chinese conceptions of everyday life and social relations to argue that the local interpersonal world is a primary means through which sociosomatic processes shape the body, and in turn, bodily processes shape social space. So for the Kleinmans, the cognitive, affective, and transpersonal processes of body social memory are interconnected and should be theorized as such. And indeed, here I would refer again to the significant work on memory in these complex ways by many of our distinguished Columbia professors here, including Mariana Hirsch, Andreas Husin, Leo Spitzer, and Lori Novak. I understand the place as critical in understanding then this kind of body socially memory interface, and I have argued this elsewhere, and in my other writings I draw inspiration in particular from both Walter Benjamin and Henri Bergson. I understand place according to both personal and social networks. They are created by human and non-human lives and processes. For Fully Love, place is an exoskeleton that plays a central function in an individual's emotional and social ecosystem. Now, if we understand places as always in the process of becoming, as within and beyond us, it can also simultaneously function as what geographer Jerry Kearns describes as a social shell. Through making and maintaining places, individuals sustain the external balance between themselves and their material and social worlds. One's personal ecosystems of places, through social relations, built environments, and everyday routines and mazeways, can also be considered according to Eric Klinenberg's discussion of the social ecologies of place. And there, in his book called Heat Wave, he discusses social ecologies of place as very distinctive. It produces a distinct nature of urban life through spatially distributed structures and textures, providing regular activities, rhythms for residents and guests, and material and social environments that nurture inhabitants. The social ecologies of place include the fabrics, tastes, sounds, and scents of places, as well as symbolic and social systems and shared memories. When social ecologies of place and social personal mazeways of place are damaged, individuals or groups may experience root shock. And Fully Love further argues that the physical fabric of the neighborhood that one grows up in also provides us with cues and opportunities for the intergenerational transmission of stories. So while root shock may affect multiple generations and can be inherited, at the same time, place memory might provide the possibilities for mourning work. Places, even when materially demolished, remain haunted by what Edward Casey describes as the unresolved remainders of memory. At some moments in time, in some places, inhabitants might encounter those residuals and move through past to possible futures and return differently to presents. So the metaphor of wounded cities working psychosocially is something to be considered seriously in theorizing the city. That means that we need to pay attention to the intimate relationships that individuals and groups have with places and their cities. And I found in my ethnographic research that residents and some of their children in Roanoke or Bogota or Berlin or Cape Town refer to some of the places from which they were forcibly removed as a kind of meta-subject. And I believe this is the case because, as I have just tried to argue here, Places become part of us even when held in common through the intimate relationships individuals and groups have with places. Yet these familiar resonances are not about territorial forms of marking or claiming my space, and this is an important point. Rather, these attachments form affective networks that give thick meaning to an inhabitant's experience of place in the city. And here I think it's important to note also that I follow art theorist Jill Bennett's understanding of affect as arising in places rather than in human subjects. So this means that it makes more sense to understand affect according to place and motility rather than to analyze affect according to identificatory relationships, an approach that assumes the origins of affect lie within individual human subjects. So such an understanding of place and affect, I believe, resonates with the ways that residents and artists speak about places as having distinct presences, material, sensual, spiritual, and psychic, but also they acknowledge that places are shared. So what I'd like to do now is turn to a couple of examples to think through the ways in which neighborhoods and individuals may have been wounded through displacement, material devastation, and root shock. And I would like to now turn to a brief discussion of Cape Town, South Africa, June 2003. The skeletal remains of 3,000 slaves and members of the colonial lower classes were unexpectedly unearthed by construction workers at the historical site known as Prestwich Place. This 2,800 square meter was once part of a much larger set of 17th and 18th century informal burial grounds of the city. It's now located in the inner city precinct of Greenpoint, where the highest priced real estate in South Africa existed at the time of the unearthing. And for more than a year, activists claiming descent from those buried at Prestwich Place halted the construction of a high-end boutique apartment, hotel, restaurant, and conference center, the Rockwell, which is now there if you go to Cape Town today. But the Hands Off Prestwich Place protests resulted in a compromise solution. Bones were exhumed and reburied in a more central memorial, and exhibitions were created also through negotiating different forms of city planning. As I talked to activists, they reflected upon their memory work. According to Stan, we kept candlelight vigils there at Prestwich Place, letting the bones know we were there, that we were present and with them. And as we stood with the wind coming down from the mountain, the candles flickering, it was though as the bones were speaking to us. And I asked him, what did the bones say? And Stan said that they should not be forgotten again. They acknowledge our presence, grateful that we were with them. Now, Stan is a very highly educated person. He is an elder. His experiences under the apartheid regime and following democratization would qualify him as somebody that we really must be paying attention to. And rather than cast away these comments as subjective or not meaningful, I understand his words as a way to talk about the significance of place in societies that have experienced extreme forms of violence. And the memory work of groups and individuals like Stan are really important because they shifted the taken for grantedness of urban space in the city. No longer just real estate, these activists claimed this place as belonging to them as citizens, and there were vigils, challenges, processions, hearings, new political organizations, and many other important contributions here that we need to pay attention to. I believe here Stan also calls us to pay attention of the way that places may act as thresholds through the living are able to make contact with those who have gone before. And residents felt a moral and ethical set of obligations to care for this place and each other across multiple generations. Now, if one takes their work seriously, then their understanding of the need to care for a place also calls us to pay attention about the significance of care as a way to repair social and material worlds. I draw here then on Joan Tronto and Berenice Fisher's work about care as a type of engagement with the world that is both rational and effective. It is a kind of species activity, they argue, that includes everything we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world. But it is not like duty or imposed obligation. It's an ethical practice. It's an attitude. It implies reaching out towards something other than the self. And Toronto argues that there are at least 4 types of caregiving that can result in ethical qualities. And I would like to expand the 4th one in just a moment. But here we can see there's caring about, taking care of, giving care, and receiving care that result in ethical and moral processes: attentiveness, responsibility, competence, and responsiveness. The communal and public memory work that the District 6 Museum in Cape Town has engaged in provide good examples of care. And again, I don't have time to go through all of their different sorts of activities, but this happened during apartheid and then post-apartheid. And through the establishment of the museum, through different programs, including workshops for community leaders, ambassador youth programs, discussion forums, land restitution debates, and other kinds of activities, they've created a lot of intergenerational dialogue and also social capital, through which individuals might gain confidence, skills, social respect when they're collaborating with one another over very many months and years, and create places for themselves and for former residents. Now, the museum has also begun to play an important advisory role for city planning, which is also quite significant. Now, the series of memory methodology workshops that I helped coordinate with the museum and community leaders offered a very significant lesson that receiving care also includes engaging from the standpoint of the other, but not assuming that the other is just like the self. So it's not a certain kind of direct empathy, but rather it's a responsiveness and it's an ability to accept care, which I would argue is the most difficult aspects. And I'd like to remind us then, too, that care challenges the notion that all individuals are the same. And this is something that I think is also important. And by way of conclusion, want to return to Proyecto Prometeo in order to consider the work by MAPA and their 5-year, multi-year collaborative projects that constituted their work that they call Art, Memory in the City. And this was during roughly 2001 to 2005, but as we'll learn tonight in Testigo de las Reunas, it still continues in different forms to this day. Now, they worked largely with residents, and they worked while their homes were being raised or right before the homes were being raised. And there were projects that they initially started on that were funded by the city's office and UNDP funds, but they began to realize that the way they wanted to work creatively was being inhibited with goal-setting agendas. And so they began to work independently and fund their own projects, working with residents with no clear outcomes. And as part of this, they needed first to confront their own biases about the neighborhood and build relationships of trust with a small group of residents, and began doing memory walks, recording them, listening to their stories, and developing a better sense of the place. And again, I think these are processes of caring for and taking care of place, particularly during a very difficult emotional period of transition. Then later, they began to have workshops for a smaller group of residences. They did body work, they had shared meals, they created different spaces for residents to share, to critically engage, even as they were being unfairly and structurally excluded from the city. And ultimately, through very complex processes over many years, what developed was Proyecto Prometeo as well as other related works. And I wanted to suggest here that not only was this process really central to place-based ethics of care, I think a really important part of this was the construction of what they call temporary communities of the imagination. And I see that this is a form of political witnessing, where they invite the audiences to do more than be spectators, and this is quite significant and the way I'd like to end. And here I draw from Diana Taylor's work about how the witness has to be active. She really draws from ancient Greek hora. You have to be on the stage, you have to challenge what the action is happening and chime in as well. Now, in terms of Latin American theater, Taylor argues that there is an acceptance of the heavy weight of sorrow, but it might broaden the scope of the possible and expand the audience and allow for a possible range of responses. So I think here, what is happening with Proyecto Prometeo is not inviting empathy grounded in affinity per se, such as I feel for you, I feel for your situation. That would be, you would imagine what it would be like in somebody else's shoes. But instead, the performances offer audiences what Jill Bennett calls an empathic vision, an effective and critical form of awareness based upon feeling for another that entails an encounter with something irreducible and different, often inaccessible. So at a conclusion here, Proyecto Prometeo conveyed shared traumas and memories as inhabited by different people through acts of collective witnessing rather than spectatorship. And I think these artists and residents working in and living in wounded cities teach us through their memory work and practices of caregiving and receiving to respect those who have gone before and treat the past as a dynamic resource in imagining different urban futures. People need to be recognized and to recognize themselves in their social and physical environments so that they can give and accept care across generations. When individuals return to places that have been wounded but are now being cared for and may offer care, they can again be surrounded by living memory and emotional attachments, providing space for mourning, critical reflection, discovery, and change. And the place-based ethics of care, as tied to memory work, contributes to what Edgar Peterson describes as a sensibility of ethical searching that trusts deliberate actions of social transformation through a multiplicity of processes and imagination. Thank you.
Saskia.